He took 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, and German auxiliaries led by his trusted ally, Arminius. Their route lay through the deep Teutoburg forest. Arminius's moment had arrived. Varus was about to find out who his true friends really were. We now return to decisive battles. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest. It is 9 AD. The Roman army in Germany is on the march to suppress a tribal revolt. At stake, the eastward expansion of the empire. Varus was leading an army of 18,000 men and a heavy baggage train with scores of wagons. The officers' baggage even included large wooden beds for comfort. The 3 legions were among Rome's finest and were Augustus's pride and joy.
Augustus was to refer to military campaigns as fishing with a golden hook. That is to say, you really are taking sometimes a risk with one of your greatest assets, your military manpower.
The Romans feared the forest as a wild and uncivilized place. They believed that the great oak forest of the north marked the edge of the world.
100 years later than the events we're discussing, Tacitus, writing his Germania, talks about semi-mythical, part human, part animal figures. So there are areas deep in the interior of Germany which are almost perceived as mythical to the Roman elite.
For the German tribes, the forest trees often marked sacred places. The Christmas tree we bring into our home each year as a reminder of those beliefs. As the Romans entered the forest, they were forced to abandon their normal marching formation. Instead, they formed a long, winding column over 2 miles long. A cavalry detachment led the way. Varus and his entourage traveled midway down the column. At this point, Arminius came to Varus and offered to take his men off and gather up more allies for the battle ahead. Varus thought about it and agreed. And Arminius and his men melted away into the forest.
That's a normal thing for someone who's on the Roman side to do. Absolutely normal. And given that Varus trusts Arminius, it's no surprise that he allows him to do that. Arminius, of course, is doing something quite different. He's taking himself away to rally forces that are going to turn against their Roman allies.
The Roman column moved on nervously. Experienced centurions peered into the dark and gloomy forest. But Varus felt secure.
He's also basically seeing this as an exercise in moving through a largely pacified landscape, and that's a dreadful mistake to make.
Arminius was a really capable commander. Varus was kind of a bumbler, but probably his greatest weakness was he didn't know he was a bumbler. He didn't accept advice.
The Romans were now confined to a narrow forest path with a steep hill on one side and a swamp on the other. To make matters worse, the weather turned nasty with heavy rain and strong winds.
They couldn't deploy in battle line. They couldn't station cavalry on the flanks to protect the infantry from counterattack on the sides, flanking motions. It was a tremendously bad place for the Romans to fight.
Suddenly, hundreds of arrows and javelins began to fly from the trees, thudding into the front of the Roman column. Hidden among the trees were the nearly 18,000 German tribesmen. The Romans were in disarray. They knew how to change formation in the face of an attack like this, but there was just no room. Soldiers collided with one another as they ran for safety. When the Romans tried to get away through the trees, they found that the Germans had filled the gaps between the trunks with earth. Construction work that must have taken weeks.
What we see is just how much other planning went into this. This has taken a lot of thought. How do you break the army up? And then, once you've got them in some of the least favourable land, how do you capitalize on that?
It probably took a couple of minutes for news of what had happened to get back to Varus.
communication must have been quite difficult along the line of the column. So terrible things could be happening in one place and the others wouldn't really know much about it. They may hear muffled screams from afar, but they wouldn't necessarily know what was going on.
Now the remainder of the German army swarmed out of the forest from both sides of the track. A volley of spears was followed by close combat with swords.
It was probably never possible to come together in legionary strength because of the nature of the battlefield, which was chosen entirely by Arminius.
Varus had been caught in the perfect ambush. He saw the shocking reality behind the slaughter. He'd been betrayed by a man he was proud to call a friend. Arminius knew from his own army experience that it would be suicide to fight the Romans on an open battlefield. Most of his army were spearmen who would not have stood a chance against disciplined formations. Now he had the legions at his mercy in his own backyard. After the first assault, the Germans ran back into the forest. Varus fell back the way he had come, and the army established a series of camps by nightfall. But the next day it was still wet and windy, and the attacks began again.
The weather was pretty desperate. Wind, rain would have made not simply keeping troops together, I think, quite difficult, but also meant that using weapons was difficult, rather difficult to use your slings and your bows in those sorts of conditions.
The rain made it difficult for the Romans to come together in a military unit to defend themselves. The rain made it impossible for them to use their bows. The rain made throwing spears useless.
Arminius aimed to break the Roman line at a number of points, cut the Roman army into sections, and then finish them off, one at a time. Groups of troops tried to make a break for it, but were